Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 6 of the Future of Work show. And today's topic is one which is so interesting and somewhat mysterious to me, the art of storytelling. So, let me, in fact, begin with a story that all of us know and have heard many, many times in our lives. The story of a king in a faraway kingdom a long, long time ago. Now, this king had been betrayed by his wife and he'd had her executed. But the matters didn't end there. He had developed such a hatred for future wives and women that he would marry a young bride and spend the night with her and have her executed the next morning. So this went on and on till all the young brides in the country had been executed, and no one knew what to do next. So the prime minister's daughter offered to be the next bride, and she told her dad that she had a ruse that would help her through this extremely complicated situation. So, as we all know in the story, every evening she sits with the king and she starts off a story which is so interesting, but then she doesn't quite end it. She leaves the story at a very interesting place, and then the king cannot have her executed the next morning. So he needs to hear the rest of the story and brings her back in. And so on, it goes on for 1,000 nights. By the end of it, the king realizes that his plan was actually very cruel and foolish, and she lives for as his queen forever. At least that's what the story says. So that's really the power of stories, the power to give people life and sometimes otherwise. So, to understand some of what gives stories their power, I have with me two amazing storytellers, Ameen and Ravi. Hi, Ameen. Hi, Ravi. Welcome to the show.
Thanks,
Hi.
Shalini.
Hi.
Hello.
So, as
Hi.
some of you might know, Ameen is the founder of Storywallahs. He's been working as a storyteller in some form or the other for about 2 decades. He has a background in advertising and theater. And we're going to ask a little bit about his motivations to start Storywallahs just a little bit later. Ravi is a graduate from IIM Ahmedabad, and he's worked in fields like consulting as an entrepreneur before starting off as a storyteller coach. And now he works with many businesses, many leaders to help them tell their stories better. So thank you, Ameen. Thank you, Ravi. So happy to have you join us today. So one of the
Thank
things
you
I
so
must,
much.
thank you. One of the things I must tell both of you that when I was going through your website and your LinkedIn page, both of you have given me some very quotable quotes. So, Ravi, I loved what you said about if data is the new oil, storytelling is the new refinery. I mean, that's supremely quotable. And Ameen, I love what you say about those who tell great stories have great stories. Is that what you say?
Yeah, it's Ira Glass actually who says this that great stories happen to those who can tell them. And Ira Glass is an NPR radio chat show host, and I just love it. And
Very
uh,
powerful. Yeah.
absolutely.
So, one of the questions I've had for a long time, and I'm obviously no storyteller at all, is just how storytelling has suddenly come to the forefront. And, say a decade ago, people may have looked at even the term storyteller with a little bit of, with a little bit of questioning that what is this job? What does one even do as a storyteller? How is that connected to business? But we've seen such a change over the last maybe 5 or 7 years where people like both of you and actually many, many others. Today, it's really not uncommon to find people write storyteller right in their LinkedIn, headline. So the field of storytelling and as it connects to business and leadership seems to have really exploded. And that's really my first question. I'd love to understand from both of you your thoughts around, what really is happening that's led to some of this prominence for storytelling.
Ravi, why don't you go
Yeah.
first?
Okay. Thank you, Amin. I think the skill has always been of importance, Shalini. So we've been storytellers since millennia, right? When we when mankind discovered fire, then we would sit around the fire and exchange stories with each other. And most of the stories had information that was critical for survival. So people learned that, hey, I need to remember these stories. So stories have been used for a long time. I think what's happened over the last, let's say, 5, 7, 10 years or so are a few factors that have increased the importance of this skill for business people, for leaders and managers. I think one is this explosion of data that we have seen. So I remember this conversation with a media company. I was working with them to improve their storytelling skills, and they were saying that earlier during the days of cable TV, we used to get data about TV viewing habits like once a week. There used to be this TAM data. They have this meter that's kept in a few households, I think 1,500 households or something, and it's sample data, and that's what they would get, and they would that's their world, and they would work with that and make sense of that and whatever. Now with the Netflixization of viewing, that same company has an online streaming platform also, and there they are getting second by second data. What happens after the 15th second? Where does attention drop off? Where do people switch? So imagine the explosion. It's not a 5-10% increase. It's an order of magnitude increase in the amount of data that is going to come, and that is hitting all of us. And so if you're having such amount of data, that's great. That means more insights, more stuff hidden there, more stuff that you can use to improve your business, improve the offering to your customers. But you have to make sense of that. So which is where I think the skill becomes more important, the refining skill of converting that crude oil into the petroleum, that storytelling skill. I think that's one big change that has happened. I would say another big change that's happened is with the attack of these devices and apps, and so many notifications that we keep getting all the time, our attention spans have taken a hit. It was not as if they were great earlier, but now I think it's even worse. It's really shortening. And so a lot of people love to quote that crazy number by the study by Microsoft in Canada, where they tried to actually measure what's the average human attention span. And you might think, okay, 5 minutes, 10 minutes or whatever. That study came up with a number of 8 seconds. And so you might dispute that number, but the point is attention spans are low and falling. And I think these two have had an impact of, the onus of the person communicating is really high to communicate well and to tell a good story with this data explosion and the lowering attention span. So for me, I think those two are two big reasons why I think storytelling has taken off, as it rightly should, over the last 5, 6, 7 years.
Ameen, what do you think?
I completely agree with Ravi. And every point that he's made, it's absolutely bang on. Data explosion leading to attention deficit syndrome, leading to the need to simplify, leading to people who can simplify becoming very important. Now, when I say simplify, it's not an easy skill. It requires pattern recognition, being able to read a pattern, being able to communicate with metaphors, analogies. Uh, it's not easy. But is it a learnable skill? Of course, it's a learnable skill. As humans, we are all born storytellers. At some level, we are born with that ability. But ability is like a knife. If you don't use it, it gets rusted. Um it's like languages. If you don't use a language, you struggle with that language. So, like Yuval Noah Harari says in his book *Sapiens*, we are born storytellers. We have the ability as a species to imagine an alternate world that does not exist. That gift of imagination is something that we are born with. We can create an alternate world and an alternate reality, and live in that reality and invest in that reality emotionally. So we've always been like that for thousands of years, millions of years. We've been sitting around fires and not making PowerPoint. We've been sitting around fires and telling stories to each other. But what happens is when data increases, like Ravi was saying, every powerful trend leads to a counter trend. Just
Yep.
like use of a lot of machinery and use of a lot of digital technologies and creating music has made us crave for unplugged and raw music, where people sit around a fire and play without any digital amplification. Uh, Something like MTV Unplugged or closer to Coke Studio. Why do we crave for that experience? Because it's raw, but it's real. It's authentic.
So let me ask you then, do you think that, given that we're entering a future which is changing much more rapidly than anything any of us have really experienced in the past, and the fact that, as you said, there is both a data explosion and a sharp reduction in maybe attention spans, do you think this role of stories itself changes? Would you call it a future skill, as people like Dan Pink, etc., have done? That in the future, being able to tell good stories is going to be, one of the critical human and leadership skills. Wonder what you think about that.
Well, look around you, not just of the future, but of the past as well. You will see that great leaders have always been good storytellers. In fact, it is one of the key skills that makes them a leader. Leader is about communicating a vision, inspiring people to follow that, buy into an idea. And whether you look at leadership at all levels, when you look at leadership at the political sphere, for example, right from Gandhi to Nelson Mandela to Barack Obama, great storytellers. If you look at leadership at the spiritual level, take Swami Vivekananda. He shook up the Western world with his articulation of Indian philosophy, great storyteller. If you look at leaders in the business domain, right from Steve Jobs to Richard Branson to Indra Nooyi, great storytellers. So you see that correlation: leadership, storytelling, leadership, storytelling, leadership, storytelling, every sphere, writings on the wall.
So see, this is so interesting. And for instance, Ravi, you did an MBA, you went to business school, you went to MICA, so at least you had some exposure to communication. But Ravi, you and I went to the same school. So, I can say that was never a central part of, say, the MBA discipline. And I don't think communication or storytelling, I don't think it ever really entered any of our MBA curriculum, except for, I think, a couple of courses which we had around learning from stories. And you yourself, Ravi, have had a career which I think started off fairly left brain. The whole, you were a chartered accountant, MBA, and then, of course, you worked with many of the consulting organizations. And then you made this transition at some point to storytelling and understanding the power of stories. How do you think all of this plays out? Like, what made you switch or not switch, but broaden your understanding of leadership and business to include storytelling and other perhaps right brain?
Sorry, Shalini, I can't hear you.
But you got the drift of that question, Ravi. Why don't you go and answer that as to how did that happen in your life from
Yeah, no, it's a very typical question, Shalini, and I think it's a bit of a misconception to kind of pigeonhole, saying that okay, CA MBA is all left brain and storytelling is a right brain skill. I think a good storyteller needs to have a balance between the left brain elements and the right brain elements. So there is a bit of a science and an art to the skill, and both are equally important, I would say. So I love a great quote by Ameen in this whole field of storytelling, right? So he has a simple 3-word definition of the word story, which is: a good story is truth well told. Yeah, so the truth part is important. You can't make mistakes with facts. You have to tell the facts, but you have to tell it well. So I think the first part, one part of my life, which has been about accounting and finance and MBA and consulting, has been about the truth part. Because truth can be complicated, it can be messy, it can be detailed. There are so many layers to the truth, and you need to have the ability to dig into that crude oil and find out that refinery. But you also have to tell it well. So I think there are other parts of my personality, and unfortunately the world tries to typically there is okay, you're a CA, you're an MBA, you're this, but we all have multiple layers to our personality, right? So apart from being some of those labels, I've also been a closet writer. I used to write, in fact, I very closely thought of going into the world of journalism when I was in my graduation, but we don't have the courage, and we follow the standard path. So that didn't happen. But I used to read a lot of history. And so I think those layers were always there within me. And I think at the right time, when it all just kind of came together, when I realized that, hey, whether it is stuff with a balance sheet, whether it is business data or history, the underlying principles of storytelling, which is making facts interesting, making it told well, those principles are the same. And so I became a huge fan of those, like a lifelong fan. I'm really like super happy to be in a place where I can actually spend time understanding and learning them, and then passing on that knowledge, whatever limited I have, to other folks and helping them improve their work outcomes. So yeah, it's been a great ride.
Ravi, what's so interesting is if we look at all skill projections for the future,
Yeah.
so if you look at, for instance, World Economic Forum's projections of what are going to be future skills right from 2022 onwards, there are things like creativity, innovation, creative problem solving, uh, and all of them are complex skills that use, both our analytical, thinking part of ourselves as well
Hmm.
as our creative and, the other side. So I think it's really interesting that when we look at, future of work and future skills, all the ones that are likely to be in demand are layered. They're
Hmm.
complex. They bring together elements of, left brain logical thinking and right brain creative work. So it's really interesting that you discovered this as you went along.
And
I
I
mean,
think we also need, sorry. I just want to,
please go ahead. Yeah.
we also need some defense against the machines, right? Because that's the other big trend that's hitting us. So we need to have some of these skills which are a mix, which
Yeah.
hopefully the programmers can't. But anyways, we'll see about that.
No, but that's a really good point,
Yeah.
because actually, whenever we speak about future of work at NQ, we work a lot with, the intersection of future of work and people in organizations or business and technology. One of the most popular questions, and understandably, because all of us are anxious about, is, what's going
Yeah.
to happen to my job? And if you look at all reports around skills needed for the future, it's exactly that, because simple
Hmm.
ones are so much easier to transfer to
Automate.
technology. The ones which are going to be in demand are the complex ones, which aren't
Yeah.
so simple and are bringing in very different elements together. So you're absolutely right there. I mean, I was really interested in understanding your story. So you started off Storywallahs in 2012, well before storytelling became a thing. Would you share a little bit about, what led you to go down that path? How did you realize you would be able to help businesses and organizations?
A little bit of madness is a simple answer, and delusion. That that's what goes into slightly being ahead of the curve. But Shalini, as a kid, I used to stammer a little bit. As a result, I was very shy and reserved and an introvert kid. Please don't give me sympathetic looks. I had a very happy childhood. Uh, but around grade sixth or seventh, my mother, who was a teacher, she enrolled me into speech therapy and theater and elocution and debate competitions and poetry recitation and extracurricular activities and Boy Scouts and National Cadet Corps, and I could go on, but you get the gist. A comprehensive damage control strategy to push me out of my comfort zone, out there in the fun, and I hated it, to be honest. But when I look back now, I'm extremely grateful to my mother because uh, speech therapy helped and theater helped. My first role in theater was to play a dead body, but it gave me a lot of confidence and to be comfortable in front of audiences. And I fell in love with theater. It became a large part of my life early enough in life. From high school, I was doing a lot of theater. In college, I was doing a lot of theater. So when I passed out of Mica, I joined Ogilvy in Mumbai. I started working in advertising. I had a day job, which was in advertising, and I had an evening job which was in theater. Both are forms of storytelling at some level. So I was not, Storywallahs wasn't born, but I was doing storytelling. I was working with theater and I was working with advertising. Now, advertising is where my work was as a communications planner. And a lot of people think of advertising, the stereotypical image is that it's toothpaste advertising or soap advertising. But we were, you advertise anything. right? You advertise political campaigns and get people to buy into a political ideology or not buy into another political ideology. You get people to buy into a savings bank account. When you open a bank, people don't easily go and open bank accounts there, but your advertising has to persuade them into doing that. Just to explain what I mean by that, when a restaurant opens in your neighborhood, you feel like going and eating there. When a bank opens in your neighborhood, you don't say, let me go and open an account. You don't know, so how do you influence people through communication to buy into an idea? How do you build trust? How do you build how do you get people to open their wallet and vote with their money? And so that got me interested in behavioral economics, in how people buy into ideas. And parallelly, I was doing theater and advertising and all of that. So in the course of that work, I really got interested into how people buy into ideas. And there I found, stories play this hugely powerful role. And I said, we don't leverage that power outside of advertising. But leaders have always done that. Now, if that could be put into a process, if it could be taught as a teachable skill where people could learn that, that would be very useful. I also wanted to help teachers. So when I started the Storywallahs, one of the desires was to help teachers become better storytellers. Teachers become teachers by doing B.Ed, M.Ed, and one of these are really dated curriculums. And what's missing there is storytelling. Now, if you think about your favorite subjects in school, it's very likely you'll remember your favorite teachers as well. And if you remember the subjects you didn't like, you'll remember the teachers you didn't like. So there's a strong correlation there. And storytelling can make any teacher, any subject interesting. So these were some of the motives with which I started Storywallahs in 2012. Uh, I had no idea it was going to become so big. And uh, yeah, but these were some of the ideas that were there at the back of my head. I still remember my mom asking me, and she has a healthy dose of sarcasm. So she asked me these three questions. She said, Acha, I mean, so, what are you going to do? You've quit your job. And she's a Malayali, and, Malayalis, their sarcasm and wit, both are displayed in an underhand way. So she said, so what is this storytelling that you're going to do? So I said, I'm going to tell stories to children. I'm going to teach people how to tell stories. Ah, nice, 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 nice. Are people going to pay you for that? That was a second question. Are people going to pay you for that? So I hadn't started, so I had no way of knowing. So I said, I don't know. So I don't know. We'll find out. Ah, yeah, of course, you don't know. You'll find out, of course, of course.
Actually, that's what I want to ask you. When you started out, in 2012, and you went to presumably business leaders and said, let me help you tell better stories, really, did people even know what you were talking about?
Yeah, that's you're right. So my mom, the third question that she asked is, "Are you mad?" But I've always believed that a little bit of madness. Ravi is a madman. Really well. I know he's mad enough. So the world has always made progress thanks to mad people. When I say mad people, I mean passionate people. I use that
Yeah,
word very respectfully.
I agree.
In Hindi, there's a word called zid.
Hmm.
And the bulb happened because Einstein had zid.
Edison.
From a realistic
Yeah.
lens, if you were to look at an HR manager going to Edison and saying, hey, can you tell me a little bit more about your project, 40 failed attempts, can we get in for a performance appraisal? You would never get a bulb
Yeah,
like that. So
true.
you have
Agree.
to keep fear at bay, and you have to wade into the water, and then only you can figure out these things. In retrospect, everything looks easy. Thankfully for us, uh, clients came to us rather than us going out. It took a long time to build the practice, like it happens in anything which is early days, and it was a slow build. uh, a lot of learnings there, a lot of failures there. You learn from your failures than from your successes. But I've been grateful for that journey and for the trust that clients have reposed.
That sounds really amazing. And I completely agree with you. I think all progress happens with unreasonable people. It's the only way the world ever changes. So, Ravi, I came across a LinkedIn post. I think you had shared a few days ago after the antitrust hearings, the big
Yeah.
tech antitrust hearings. And I was really fascinated by the criteria you had used to judge each of the leaders, business leaders, in their effectiveness of storytelling. So, would you mind sharing a little bit about why? Firstly, why did you think this was even an important topic, to
Yeah.
cover? Like, why should their storytelling skills even matter? And
Sure.
second, why you used the four criteria that you had?
No, yeah, thanks for that, Chandni. So, I'm a big fan of good storytellers, and there are, of course, good storytellers from all walks of life. Harsha Bhogle is a fabulous storyteller when it comes to cricket. Shekhar Gupta is great at politics. Malcolm Gladwell is brilliant when it comes to some of his, non-fiction books. But in the world of business, there are, of course, leaders. And then when you marry that with what I call as a high stakes story event, then there is story magic happening, right? Because not all communication by leaders is critical, but there are these high stakes ones. And Steve Jobs was a master at that. So he would know that, okay, the iPhone launch is a once in a lifetime event. Let me put the best effort at that. Now, all of these four, it's not that every year or every few years you'll be tried by the U.S. Congress, and your voice, your story, your words will be read and heard and interpreted by millions, if not billions, around the world. So a lot of thought would go into these stories, right? So it's very senior leaders, probably the tallest leaders and business leaders in the world, and B, very high stakes events. So that was what I think drew me to analyze that. Now, in terms of how to analyze that, I basically try and break it down, and it's actually probably a little unnatural because many people probably just write. They don't really think that, oh, okay, I'll first put a structure and then I'll do this. Although some people do that too, but many people just write from their heart, right? But for me, the idea is to try and see what can others learn. If others want to learn, how can we break it into these smaller pieces, and then say, okay, hey, this piece was very well done here versus this piece was not so well done here, and so on. And when I try to do that, I try and look at a story as like a layered cake. For food aficionados, there's a multi-level cake, and then you try and see, okay, what's the base of this cake? The base of this cake is like the story structure or a framework, so the broad outline of the story that they're talking about. And then you keep adding the layers. So there's probably a human story layer there somewhere. When people are talking about themselves, they're being vulnerable, you get to know them well, you probably trust them a little bit more. When people, instead of just reeling out statistics about the impact that they have had, when they are able to say, hey, this is a story of one person, one single mom living in rural Indiana who has benefited from our product, then that makes it more interesting. When people are adding layers of curiosity, of surprise, and so on, so there are this bunch of layers that are there. And then there, of course, if you're making a presentation, there is a visual layer because you have to kind of put it on slides. And finally, if you're actually talking through it, there's a delivery layer. So broadly, there's narrative, visuals, delivery. These are the three big ones. And then within that, there are these multiple parts of the storytelling cake. And so I just basically then try and break it down and then see, okay, oh, this one, I thought Bezos did a great job of telling his personal story. I didn't see any of that coming in Tim Cook's story, and so on. So it's a little presumptuous of me to kind of go and make some of these points, but I think it's fun also. Yeah, so that's the approach I used, Shalini.
It was a really fascinating take. And just remind me, there were four criteria, right? One was
Yeah.
personal story, stakeholder story, then data
Yeah, so
story,
for
was it?
Yeah, so broadly, if you see, there is something about the data and then something about the human element of the story, right? So in the human
Right.
element, I kind of broke it into two parts. One is your own story. You are a leader, but you're not Amazon. You're Jeff Bezos. You're Sundar Pichai. Tell me about your story. And Sundar Pichai did allude to it, saying that when he grew up in Madurai in India. I didn't have access to a computer. So when I went to a lab in the US the first time and I saw, oh my God, so many computers all available to me, you could almost sense that wonder in his tone, although he had kind of toned it down a bit in the story, but you could see that. And Jeff Bezos also went full ballistic. It was brilliant. His own mom, who used to sit in class, was so driven. She was a teenage mom. She used to have him by the side, give him something to eat or drink, and keep him occupied while she is learning. And such a wonderful story. Immediately makes him so human, so likable. And both of them did that well. Then there was a stakeholder story, which is, you're telling you're making an impact on it, so many million employees, so many million customers, but can you tell me the story of one such person, one real flesh and blood person? Who is that person? Why should I care about that person? And so that was a second one, which I thought, a couple of them did well, but the others didn't really bother too much. Then there is the numbers and the data story, and that is important. Ultimately, a lot of numbers are being leveled against you, and this is your platform to tell your side of the story and talk about saying, okay, this is why I felt we are really making a big impact, and we are actually in a very competitive space, and here are some numbers to back that up. So this is also a place where you kind of try to refute what I call as the anti-story or the anti-story, which is, what is the narrative that is being spun against you, that hey, you're becoming too big, you're trampling over all these small guys. And now I'm not taking positions here because I have no way of knowing, but the point is you have to tell your side of the story, and all of these guys attempted to do that in some way. And finally, okay, so you have data and numbers to back it up, but what's your vision of the world, what's your narrative of the world, and where you fit in? What's your big picture story? So there is a big picture story about you that's being spun in the outside world, but what's your take on it? So that was a fourth element. Yeah, so those were the four things that I thought would be interesting for us to analyze them and maybe use in our own stories.
Thanks, Ravi. I mean, you've been working with leaders now for, quite a while. Do you think that there are some parts of storytelling that leaders in India find particularly challenging?
Oh yeah. Uh, there is, quite a bit actually. So we find that particularly, when we have to share our own stories, right? We are good with the work story. We are good with
Yeah.
the organization story. We're good with the brand story. But what about you? What's in it for you? Why does this matter to you?
Mm.
Uh, we are not that comfortable with the idea of vulnerability and
Yeah.
opening ourselves up. But you know this, and we know this, that people don't work for organizations alone. People work for people. And the face of the organization is also the leader. So the personal story is something that in my work, I find leaders, some, in India particularly, because India is a power distance culture. It's a hierarchical culture, and we feel comfortable talking about the work story. But work is so important. We derive a sense of identity for work from work. We derive a sense of success from work. Uh, so it's a reflection of where we are in culture and where we are in time. But I think it requires a lot of self assurance
Yeah.
to tell a personal story.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. I think it's really hard. And if I think back, I think there are very few examples I can think of people, particularly in the corporate world. I mean, might have heard a little more in, say, the impact world, where people can connect what they're doing with, the mission of the organization. But one will really have to think back to see the very few examples of people who have the comfort with revealing a personal story. And if I'm honest, that same would hold for me as well. I think that's one area which I still haven't ventured quite comfortably into. I mean, when we spoke last time, one of the things you said I found really, 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 really interesting, because in OD we use it from another, from a completely different direction. The power of the stories we tell ourselves, and how you work with people in, them evolving the stories of themselves. Could you share
Sure.
a little bit about how that works and its
Sure.
impact?
Sure. So, since it's early days for storytelling in India, a lot of storytelling often gets confused with presentation skills. A lot of storytelling also gets confused with oratory uh, and public speaking, etc. But all of that is outer directed. A large part of storytelling is not just outer directed, but inner directed. The story that we tell ourselves, the story that we buy into. Uh, and that's what makes the story authentic, because if you don't have belief in the story and if you're saying something else, people can figure that out. The message is not going to land. But let me go a little deeper to explain the importance of this. And let me try and do that through a story. We are talking about stories. Let me tell you a story. Um, this story concerns an athlete. It comes, from way back in time, 1938. There was a Hungarian athlete, pistol shooter, champion pistol shooter called Karoly Zaks, and Karoly wanted to represent his country. He was a sergeant in the army, and one day during regular army drill, a hand grenade exploded in his hand, and he woke up in a hospital with the hand gone. They had to amputate his hand. Uh, so those were not the days when we had inclusion and diversity policies. Certainly not in the army. So your career is over. Your career as a pistol shooter is over, and that's the time when most of us would look up and ask that guy up there, why me? Why me? And why now? When I was so close to achieving my goal, why not at age 90? Or why not, if I had been born with that, I would have, made peace with that. But why now? So he was asking himself these kind of questions. And people would come to meet him at the hospital, they would console him, and that would make him feel much worse. Uh, I just like to reconfirm, are you with me so far? Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, very clear.
everyone said.
So a couple of days later, he just disappeared, and people couldn't find him. And they tried looking for him, but they couldn't find him. And then he goes to the forest and starts shooting, with his left hand, a hand that he has never used in his life. And he trains for a year, and comes back a year later to win the championship in Hungary. But his dream to represent the country in Olympics remains just a dream, because 1940 the World War happened. 1944, 4 years later, the World War still going on. 1948, he's lost 10 years. 1948, and you know how important age is. 1948, he goes to the Olympics after World War, and he breaks the world record and establishes a new world record shooting with his left hand. 1952, he goes to the Olympics again and wins gold again. Now, I'm paraphrasing what he said,
Yeah.
and what he said was, when that happened, I had two choices. I could look at the hand that was not there, and spend the rest of my life looking at the hand that was not there, and asking myself, why me, why now? Or I could look at the other hand that was still there, and you just need one hand to shoot a pistol. So, it's a story to me that embodies this idea that what stories we tell ourselves, they shape us, they make us. And if from a behavioral perspective, if you were to look at, where do actions come from? Our actions come from our belief systems. And where do belief systems come from? Our belief systems come from the stories we buy into. Even a simple action, when we touch somebody by mistake while walking, with our legs, what do? We bend down and touch the lower part of that body, that person's body, to our head. Why do we do that? That action comes from a belief system that a God resides in everyone. And I have just touched a God with the lowest part of my body. So what do? I don't back off like in the Western system and say, hey, buddy, sorry. In fact, I lean forward. I bend and touch the lowest part of that person's body, and touch it back to my head, so that these two gods are back in equilibrium. Now, where is that action coming from? That action comes from a belief system. And that belief system comes from a story that we buy into. So if you want to change actions, you have to change belief systems, and you have to change belief systems, you have to change the story. And that's where what story we buy into becomes very important. And as a leader, when you're very clear about that, because your decisions impact a lot of people. So it's very important what story we tell ourselves.
Then, I mean, as what advice would you give a leader on telling better stories to themselves personally? Two or three things that you think would be helpful for them to keep in mind.
This work is, at a leadership level, it becomes very deep work. And first of all, you have to be very, very rooted and self-assured and realistic, and be aware of the responsibility of a leader, as to how many lives depend on you, and the burden that you carry as a leader. Leadership is not an opportunity to lead. A lot of people look at leadership as a reward. What I mean by that is, I've worked for 30 years, and I have risen through the ranks, and I slogged and I gave the best part of my years to this company, and now I have earned this reward. It is not a reward, it is an opportunity to serve. That mindset, again, so what is the story? Are you seeing this? If the story of the elevation is that as a reward, you got that story wrong.
So the story of leadership itself.
The story of leadership
Leadership
itself,
itself.
it's not a reward. So today the story of leadership, a lot of people think of it as, I served 30 years in this company, I have risen through the ranks, I have put my sweat and blood, now is my time to sit in that cabin, now is my time to, I have earned this reward. It's not a reward, it's an opportunity to serve. This is more difficult now. This is not a reward for everything that you did in the past. This is now about the future, and that's not going to be easy, but it's a huge responsibility. So that when you have clarity about the story of leadership itself, first of all, that what story are you telling yourself of that leadership, it starts from there. So that's the first point, that what is the story you are telling yourself about your elevation into that role and your role as a leader. So it starts there. um, then I think it is about authenticity. And story is not about telling, it is about doing, it is about being, it is about living that story. Because as a leader, you're at a platform, you're elevated, everybody's watching you. Let me give an example. You can say everything at an induction, and you can have all of these big words on the walls, on the posters, on the elevators, in the conference rooms, etc. But values have to be in action, they have to be lived behavior. So the leader has to, I say the story is not saying, story is doing. Here's an example. Narayan Murthy, Infosys, back in the days, wanted to send a message out that we should be cost conscious in the company, and we should spend the company's money in a way that as if it's our own money. Now he could have sent a memo, but instead of that, what did he do? He started flying economy. He started, now one of the richest guys, let this sink in, one of the richest guys in India flies economy. He has earned it, but that's not the story he's bought into. It is not about reward. He's saying, I'm not asking you to do something that I can't do myself.
So
Story
in a
has to
sense,
be
sorry, I'm just going to just jump in a little. In a sense, you're speaking about living a story.
living the story. Yeah.
And
Being
for a leader, living a story is the most authentic and the most real part of storytelling. Is that
Absolutely. Two more stories very quickly. Ratan Tata, he was on the way with his colleagues in a car on a long distance journey, and the car had a punctured tire. Most of us use a brake for a welcome smoke break. Men use it for a loo break in the open. Uh, so he was traveling with his senior colleagues, and they took the opportunity to stretch and have a smoke maybe, and soon realized that Mr. Tata is nowhere to be found. And they went looking for him. Guess where they found him? He was sitting, kneeling down on the road with the driver, sleeves rolled up, helping him change the tire. Values have to be lived and demonstrated. They are not to be put up on posters. No, that's another story. And Gandhi is the best example of that. He didn't say, boycott British products. He wove it, or he didn't only say boycott British products. He wore khadi woven on his own charkha by his own hands. He traveled third class with the common man, and he didn't say, go break the salt rule and I am there watching. He took the lathi on his head. In Indian army, the casualty rate for officers is really high, and that's because our officers lead from the front. That's what Gandhi was doing. He took the first blow of lathi on his head. So leadership is action. It's not action over words, deeds over words.
No, I completely agree with you. In fact, if you want to judge any organization's culture, the place to start is the stories which are being told about how things actually work here. What people have said in a formal forum is pretty much irrelevant, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's what are people who work for that organization really saying about it? And particularly, what are they saying about, the critical incidents when there was a dilemma and actually a choice to be made. What choice did that organization or that leader make? And that's really the most powerful way of speaking out your values by living them. But isn't there, though, a little bit of a difference between living your story, which of course people who know you, who have an opportunity to observe you, like people who work in your organizations do, and storytelling in a more communicative fashion? Like, for instance, as Ravi spoke about, how he observed leaders in one very small context, which is, the antitrust hearing, where it wasn't like working for Microsoft or for Google and looking at the leader, but watching what they said in a particular forum and a particular context. So isn't that a difference between truly living your story, and obviously that's the most powerful way of communicating your story for your organization and for people who are going to know you for a period of time, and storytelling in, say, a more specific context like this one, where communicating your story becomes the more shall I say, important part. So I'm wondering, Ravi, if you have any suggestions for any of our viewers and me as well, how we can all become better storytellers.
Absolutely, Shalini, and a great story, right? The story is by Ameen. So, one way to kind of build on what he said, and to kind of answer your question also. So, a good leader needs to ensure that the story he is telling, and not just, of course, the story is also doing, but story that leaders also tell stories, is in alignment with, I would say, three variables or three parts, moving parts, whatever name you want to call them. And so one variable or one moving part is the leader himself, his identity, his beliefs, his actions, his thoughts. And as Ameen is rightly saying, that there are many leaders who will say something at a forum, but they don't do that. They do something else. And then that immediately makes them not a good storyteller. Unfortunately, the word storytelling gets a bad rep because of folks like this, because they say, "Arey, kahani mat sunao, numbers batao." Or, we know this, he's just spinning a story, he's just doing rhetoric. And politicians do this. We know some business leaders also who do this. So I think that is one important axis to align your story to. The other two important axes for me are, you also need to align it to your audience. Yeah. And so if the first one is to be authentic, the second one is to be empathetic. You need to know who is your audience, where are they coming from, what are their fears, their challenges, their emotional reactions. Also, how easy or difficult will they find to understand what you're telling them? Forget about every day. We are not dealing with highly emotional stuff, right? Regular everyday communication, it's just passing on data and information from one person to the other. And probably I'm not going to react emotionally to your data, but my barrier is not emotional problem. It's just your data is too complex. You're not simplifying the story to me. So a good storyteller will be empathetic to the understanding ability of the audience, and then say, "Hey, I've got a ton of stuff, but here is how I'm making it simple and easy for you to understand." And then I'll also, of course, keep in mind your emotional reaction. So the empathy angle is also about, knowing what is the logical and the emotional barriers that will be coming in your audience's mind to kind of understand something. And the third angle or the third axis is the data itself, the truth. You may be authentic in believing something. So let's say there is a social impact leader who authentically or very truly believes that X is the right way of doing something, but the data, the actual underlying data, does not support that belief. In that case also, I think it's not a great story. So it's not an easy ask, but that's the right balance of being aligned on your own story, authenticity, on your audience's reaction, empathy, and the truth, or the clear comprehensive truth. So that's one, three things that need to be done. And I'll give you just one simple tip on the empathy part, right? So there's a very simple, nice storytelling tip called show, don't tell. If you're telling me that you are an innovative company, that you really value innovation, don't tell it to me. Tell me a story, show a story, a visual story where you have actually acted in a way that values innovation. So an example that comes to mind is this newsletter by this company called the Ken. So every Saturday they release a newsletter called Nutgraph, and I'm a big fan of it because they go deep and dive into fairly complicated topics and try and explain it, and not just explain it but also tell us what will be the implication for us in our daily life. So for example, when the Geo big launch happened, I loved the way they analyzed, how Geo was building a very unique company. So the story that struck me was the one that happened last Saturday. So every Saturday it comes out, and this was about there's this new AI revolution that's happened by this company called OpenAI, which is called GPT-3. And I'm not tech geek, so I don't understand what GPT-3 means, but I know that it's a revolution in the sense that now it's able to write stuff almost like humans, and that's freakish. It's able to code, it's able to write, and so the future is coming closer and closer. And so this guy, the Nutgraph guy, Praveen Gopalkrishnan, was writing the story of GPT-3, and he's going into the details. So he writes a beautiful intro about GPT-3, and then he goes into the nuts and bolts of okay, what happened, who used it, how did it happen, and all of this is happening. And in the end, he just writes a brilliant line where he says, guys, this was so intriguing that I wanted to try and see if I can use it myself. So I applied and I got through permission to use GPT-3 for myself, and I've actually used this in this very piece. You know how? Go back and read the first 200 words, the intro piece that you liked so much. That was not written by me, it was written by GPT-3.
You
And so
know,
instead of
yeah, please,
saying
sorry.
that GPT-3 is innovative, he showed it to us. It's a show don't tell moment. So that's one powerful tip that I thought I could share with the listeners. Sorry,
So that
Sasha.
example just reminded me of so my co-founder Jaspreet in his book Tech Whisperer. He has a
Hmm.
chapter which is written by AI. The book is about
Oh my God, this is the
technology.
future is already here. The robots are taking our jobs.
So that
It's scary,
was
scary stuff.
so. I'm going to ask one last question. I mean, and anyone who is listening, and if you have any questions, please do post them, and I'll ask them on your behalf. I mean, is there anything that you could share around, if any of us want to be better storytellers, two or three easy takeaways for us?
Sure. First, the point that I had already covered, which is live your story, so that
Right.
it's authentic. When your actions are in alignment with your beliefs, and when your beliefs are in alignment with your value systems, right? So when what you say is aligned with what you do, and what you do is aligned with your belief systems, the story will be authentic. Number two, remember the best story about Shalini is not the one Shalini tells herself, but the one that Ravi tells me about Shalini, or the one that Jaspreet tells me about Shalini. So we live in the word of mouth economy, and today it's a review economy. If I have to join an organization, first I'll go to Glassdoor, and I'll see what people are saying about. If I have to go and book a hotel, I will not book a hotel, but I will say what are other people saying about that hotel. That's why we go to TripAdvisor. If you have to take a cab, so fix your story there. It's not about what you say, but what others are already saying about you. So your story is in play, and others, your customers, are in charge of your story already. So look for alignment there. Look for alignment within. Point number one. Look for alignment outside. Are your stakeholders aligned with what you're saying? That's point number two. Number three, I haven't seen a good storyteller worth his or her salt who's not a great listener. In my book, storytelling comes later, listening comes first. If you're not a great listener, you can't be a good storyteller. Forget it. And listening is tied into understanding, like Ravi was talking about empathy with your listeners. What are their concerns about understanding that? Then comes the point about articulation, fourth. So after these three, you come to articulation, and there it's not just what we say, but also how we say it. That makes a lot of difference. And in this articulation, there's a huge battery of techniques that you can learn about how to frame something in a way that connects to people's hearts. But the simplest and the most powerful example that I can cite and close this story with is the video that has gone viral on YouTube. It's called the Power of Words video, where there's a blind man sitting and asking for money, and he's got a play card there, a cardboard on which he's written, "I am blind, please help." But that message, that story is not working, and people are passing by, and he's using the magic words that we teach children, right? Please help, all of that. "I am blind, please help." And a lady comes and changes that. She writes something else, and magic happens, and people are putting in money. So later, when that lady comes back, he asks her, "What did you do to my sign?" And she says, "I wrote the same thing. but in different words. And the camera zooms out and you see what's written there is, it's a beautiful day, but I can't sleep.
Oh, that is
So,
powerful.
after you've checked for alignment on your story at three levels, internal, external, which is are your stakeholders, and listening, comes articulation, which is very powerful. It's not what you say, but also how you say it. That makes a lot of difference. And that applies to numbers and data, that applies to your work story, your vision story, the organization story, the value story, the change management story, the inclusion and diversity. It's not what we say, but also how we say it. And like Ravi was saying, there are two parts to a story. I've always believed this: truth, well told. Now, to me, that's a good three-word summary of storytelling. Truth, well told. There are two parts to that. There's truth and well told. That guy was telling the truth. I am blind, please help. What was missing was the well told.
It's a beautiful story. I mean, that's a really beautiful story. And we really believe that storytelling is going to be much more important than ever in the past because the environment around us is changing so much that we need, everybody is looking for something that ties it together and makes sense of it. Otherwise, it's very difficult for any of us, either in our individual capacity or in our organizational capacity, to know what needs to happen. And therefore, for leaders, being able to tell good stories becomes so important because it helps give perspective, a sense, a reason why something should or should not happen. Uh, and because the environment is changing so fast, therefore, the ability to keep people aligned, can no longer rest with just protocol or procedure or systems, which, while very helpful, also play a role in slowing down action. So, stories have this advantage that on the one hand, they can give you immediate clarity on what's important and what's not. And at the same time, they don't really necessarily tie down your action, in a very narrow band, which is perhaps the reason why, in all cultures of the world, stories and particularly mythology and, epics have played such an important role in, while they're not prescriptive, but they give you this broad canvas of, what the big truths are and what are the grand rights and absolute wrongs. So I'm going to look at some of the questions. So we have a question from Mayank. He asks, do we as storytellers focus more on failures or success?
Ravi?
Yeah. No, I think both stories are important. But I think failure, as Ameen was saying, failure teaches us more. Success, or what do they say? Success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan, right? So failures teach us more. And if, especially leaders who otherwise have credibility in what they do, if they share stories of their own failures, I think it's a great trait, because it shows them to be vulnerable, to be human, to not be this demigod kind of a person that, oh, I've never made a mistake in my life. And more importantly, it tells the others that, hey, it's okay to try and fail, and this is not a you'll be fired at the first mistake kind of a culture. So I would kind of give a slightly more higher weightage to stories of failure. I think those are the ones that have more learning in them.
Okay. Okay. So
I,
I
I,
think,
I
yeah,
agree with
go ahead, Anand.
Yeah, I mean.
I saying I agree with Ravi completely. It's not the failure stories or success stories. Which story is more important? Which authentic story is? Story is a tool, which it serves a purpose. So what's the purpose? And for certain purposes, you need success stories, and certain purposes you'll need failure stories. So start not with by looking within and saying, okay, I've got a failure story. Now I want to tell the world the failures. That's
There's no point. Yeah.
because the moment you start doing it for the wrong reasons, that's the end of it. Story is like a story is not about spinning a yarn. I hate that word spin. Uh, it's about it's about conveying a message that people can connect with at a deeper level, and therefore start with the purpose. Why would I use this tool? And if the purpose requires a success story, and they're very important as well, go ahead and use a success story. Otherwise, you know जंगल में मोर नाचा किसने देखा. We live in an attention deficit economy. Who's got the time to figure out what good work you've done? You have to make the effort of going and telling it.
And
Thank
in
you.
fact, many companies kind of spend a lot of time creating these success story case studies, right? And the moment it is made as a case study, with these boxes to be filled, I think it completely takes away the story element of it. I think that there's a lot of potential to really make those come out alive as a story. So yeah, I think great point. I mean, yeah. Sorry, Shan, go ahead.
No, thank you. Thank you. I realize that we are at the end of our time. For me, actually, leaving our conversation today, some of the things which really stand out is one, the best stories are truth well told. I thought that was really, really powerful and bring both together. I think some of the things which we spoke about stories having, and I think Ravi, you alluded to it in the way you spoke about how leaders told their stories. The whole piece of logic, data coming together with having an emotional impact, and
Right.
that coming together as being a very powerful. So my big takeaways are both the truth well told, and which is actually almost the same thing, but
Yeah, same thing.
having having the logic, the data, etc., along with an emotional connect in the way it is told, is really seems to be at the heart of creating a story which has impact. And that's a very, very that's a beautiful takeaway for all of us. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ameen. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
with us today. Thank
Thank
you.
you for a lovely conversation, and for bringing me and Ravi on the same platform. Uh, I'm a big admirer of the work he does.
Thank you so much, Shan. It was great fun. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, thank you everyone for joining us. Do stay with us for our episode next week. On Independence Day, we have the legend himself, Mr. Gurcharan Das, joining us to talk about how do we build a better India. And I mean, I can't think of a better person on a better day for that conversation. So please do join us. Um, a recording of our conversation today will be available on my LinkedIn profile right after. Otherwise, follow us at Uncube on LinkedIn, Twitter, and this particular conversation will be on our website by Monday. With that, thank you very much. Have a nice weekend and see you next week.